On the afternoon of December 15th, 1961, a man walked into the American Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, and asked to speak with someone from the Central Intelligence Agency. The temperature that day hovered just below freezing, and a light snow had been falling since morning, coating the city's streets and buildings in a thin layer of white. The man wore a dark overcoat and carried a briefcase. He was 35 years old, of average height and build, with thinning dark hair and the kind of unremarkable appearance that intelligence officers are trained to cultivate. His name was Anatoly Mikhailovich Golitsyn, and he was a major in the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations. What he was about to tell the CIA would trigger one of the most destructive periods of internal suspicion in the history of Western intelligence services. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. The embassy official who initially met with Golitsyn was Frank Freiberg, a first secretary in the political section who also served as the CIA station chief in Helsinki. Declassified CIA records show that Freiberg conducted a preliminary interview that lasted approximately 90 minutes, during which Golitsyn identified himself as a KGB officer stationed in Helsinki under diplomatic cover and stated that he wished to defect to the United States. He claimed to possess detailed knowledge of KGB operations in Western Europe and North America, including information about Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence services. He said he had been planning his defection for several months and had chosen Helsinki because of its proximity to the Soviet Union and because he believed the CIA presence there would be able to arrange his extraction quickly. Freiberg's report, sent to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, via encrypted cable that same evening, described Golitsyn as calm, articulate, and apparently sincere. The report noted that Golitsyn had provided several pieces of information that could be verified relatively quickly, and including the names of KGB officers operating undercover in various Western capitals and details about current Soviet intelligence operations. Freiberg recommended that headquarters authorize Golitsyn's immediate extraction from Finland to prevent any possibility of Soviet attempts to recapture or assassinate him. The authorization came within 18 hours. On December 16th, 1961, CIA officers escorted Golitsyn, along with his wife Svetlana, a former Leningrad schoolteacher who had married Golitsyn in 1951, and their 14-year-old daughter Nina, to the Helsinki airport. Using false documentation prepared by CIA Technical Services, the family boarded a commercial flight to Stockholm, Sweden. From Stockholm, they were transported on a U.S. military aircraft to Frankfurt, West Germany. From Frankfurt, another military flight carried them to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C., where they arrived on December 18, 1961. The initial debriefings of Anatoly Golitsyn began immediately upon his arrival in the United States. The sessions were conducted at a CIA safe house in suburban Virginia, a large colonial-style home surrounded by mature trees that provided privacy from neighbors and passing traffic. CIA records indicate that the debriefing team initially consisted of 6 officers, including specialists in Soviet operations, counterintelligence, and Russian language and culture. The lead debriefer was Peter Deryabin, himself a former KGB officer who had defected to the West in 1954 and who now worked as a consultant to the CIA's Soviet-Russia division. Golitsyn's background, as he described it during those initial debriefings, all followed a pattern common among Soviet intelligence officers of his generation. He had been born in 1926 in Piryatin, a small city in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. His father, Mikhail Golitsyn, had been an accountant working for a state agricultural collective. His mother, Anna, had worked as a schoolteacher. In Golitsyn's account, his family had been relatively privileged by Soviet standards. His father's position in the collective's administrative structure had provided them with slightly better housing and food rations than ordinary collective farmers received. Golitsyn described his childhood and adolescence as shaped primarily by the war. He had been 15 years old in June 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. His city had been occupied by German forces for more than 2 years. His father had been killed in 1943, shot by German soldiers for reasons Golitsyn said he never fully learned. His mother and younger sister had survived the occupation, though food had been scarce and conditions brutal. When Soviet forces liberated Piryatin in September 1943, Golitsyn, then 17, had volunteered for the Red Army. He had served for the final 18 months of the war as a junior radio operator attached to a signals unit. After the war ended in May 1945, Golitsyn had remained in military service. By 1946, he had been selected for officer training and had attended a military academy in Moscow, studying communications and signals intelligence. It was during this period, in his later accounts, that he had first attracted the attention of Soviet intelligence recruiters. He had demonstrated aptitude for languages. He spoke Ukrainian and Russian natively and had learned passable German during the occupation, and had scored well on aptitude tests measuring analytical thinking and attention to detail. In 1948, at age 22, Golitsyn had been recruited into the KGB's predecessor organization, the MGB, which stood for Ministry of State Security. He had undergone extensive training at the intelligence service's main training facility outside Moscow, learning tradecraft, surveillance techniques, cryptography, and the operational methods used to recruit and handle foreign intelligence assets. His debriefing statements indicated that he had been assigned initially to the 2nd Chief Directorate, responsible for internal security and counterintelligence within the Soviet Union. However, in 1952, he had been transferred to the 1st Chief Directorate, which handled foreign intelligence operations. Between 1952 and 1961, Golitsyn had served in various capacities within the 1st Chief Directorate's organizational structure. He had spent time in the American Department, responsible for operations targeting the United States and Canada. He had worked in the Strategic Analysis section, which evaluated intelligence collected from all sources and prepared assessments for Soviet political and military leadership. And he had served as a case officer managing agents in Western Europe. His final posting before his defection had been in Helsinki, where he had been stationed since August 1960 under diplomatic cover as a second secretary in the Soviet embassy's consular section. What made Golitsyn valuable to the CIA, what made his defection significant beyond the routine acquisition of yet another Soviet intelligence officer, was not so much his access to operational details, though that was considerable, but rather his understanding of the KGB's strategic thinking and organizational culture. Unlike many defectors, who could provide information about specific operations they had been involved in or specific agents they had known, Golitsyn claimed to understand the broader strategic framework within which the KGB operated. He said he could explain how Soviet intelligence services thought about long-term objectives, how they assessed Western vulnerabilities, and most importantly, how they used deception and disinformation as strategic tools. During his first 6 months of debriefing, from December 1961 through June 1962, Golitsyn provided information that led to several significant counterintelligence successes for the CIA and Allied intelligence services. He identified John Vassall, a British Admiralty clerk who had been providing classified documents to Soviet intelligence since 1954. Vassall was arrested by British authorities in September 1962 and later sentenced to 18 years in prison. Golitsyn provided information that helped identify Hugh Hambleton, a Canadian economist who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while working for NATO in the 1950s. Hambleton would eventually be arrested in 1982 and sentenced to 10 years in a British prison. Golitsyn also provided detailed information about Soviet penetrations of various Western European intelligence services, including the French Intelligence Service, SDECE, and the West German BND. Some of this information proved accurate and led to arrests or dismissals. Other information was less definitive but created sufficient suspicion to damage careers and disrupt operations. But it was Golitsyn's claims about penetrations of the CIA itself that would have the most destructive impact on Western intelligence operations over the subsequent 2 decades. In early 1962, during a debriefing session focused on KGB operations targeting American intelligence services, Golitsyn stated that based on information he had seen while working in the First Chief Directorate's American department, the KGB had succeeded in placing multiple agents, what intelligence services call penetrations or moles, inside the CIA. He claimed that these penetrations had reached high levels within the agency's Operations Directorate and its Soviet division. He said that the KGB had been receiving classified information from these sources for several years, and that this information had allowed Soviet intelligence to identify and neutralize CIA operations throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The specific details Golitsyn provided about these alleged penetrations were vague and largely circumstantial. He could not name the penetrations because, he said, he had never had direct access to their identities. Such information was compartmented within the KGB to prevent exactly the kind of compromise his defection represented. What he could provide were what intelligence analysts call indicators, pieces of information that, when assembled, might point toward the existence and possible identity of penetrations. These indicators included knowledge that certain CIA operations in the Soviet Union had been compromised, awareness that Soviet intelligence had received advance warning of CIA recruitment attempts, information suggesting that classified CIA documents had been photographed and transmitted to Moscow, and general statements about the KGB's confidence in its penetration of American intelligence. The problem with indicators is that they can point in multiple directions. A compromised operation could mean there is a penetration, or it could indicate the operation was poorly planned, or it could suggest the target was more security conscious than anticipated, or it could be simple bad luck. Advance warning of a recruitment attempt might come from a penetration, from routine surveillance, or from the target reporting the approach. The receipt of classified documents might indicate a penetration, document theft, or careless security practices. James Jesus Angleton, who in 1962 was the CIA's chief of counterintelligence, took Golitsyn's claims seriously. Angleton, then 45 years old, had been with the CIA since its founding in 1947 and had previously served with the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. He was a legendary figure within the intelligence community, known for his intellectual brilliance, his encyclopedic knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations, and his deeply suspicious approach to uncovering penetrations and deception operations. Later accounts from CIA officers who worked with him show that Angleton believed Soviet intelligence services operated according to sophisticated strategic deception plans that could extend over years or even decades. He believed that the KGB planted false defectors to mislead Western intelligence, that it sacrificed lower-level agents to protect more valuable penetrations, and that it conducted operations designed not to collect intelligence, but to manipulate Western decision-making. Golitsyn's claims about KGB penetrations of the CIA fit perfectly with Angleton's worldview. Beginning in 1962, Angleton launched an intensive internal investigation, what would later become known simply as the Mole Hunt, to identify the penetrations Golitsyn had described. The investigation would eventually examine the backgrounds, associations, and professional activities of hundreds of CIA officers. It would destroy careers, damage morale, and paralyze significant portions of the CIA's Operations Directorate for more than a decade. The investigation operated according to a methodology that, in retrospect, appears to have been fundamentally flawed. Because Golitsyn could not identify the penetrations directly, Angleton and his counterintelligence staff developed profiles based on the indicators Golitsyn had provided. They looked for CIA officers who had been involved in operations that had been compromised. They looked for officers who had access to the kinds of classified information the KGB appeared to possess. They looked for officers whose career trajectories or personal circumstances might make them vulnerable to recruitment. The problem was that in an organization the size of the CIA in the 1960s, which employed thousands of people and conducted thousands of operations globally, almost any profile could match multiple individuals. An officer who had worked on compromised operations might be a penetration or might simply have been unlucky in his assignments. An officer with access to classified information might be leaking it to the Soviets or might be doing his job properly. An officer with personal difficulties might be vulnerable to recruitment or might just be experiencing challenges in his life. As the investigation expanded, Angleton's methodology became increasingly convoluted and ultimately self-defeating. He began to suspect that any evidence clearing someone might itself be part of an elaborate KGB deception designed to protect the real penetration. If an officer's background check came back clean, that could mean he was innocent, or it could mean the KGB had carefully constructed a false background. If an operation succeeded, that could be genuine success, or it could be the KGB allowing it to succeed to build the officer's credibility. If an officer produced valuable intelligence, that could be legitimate work, or it could be the officer establishing credibility before eventually revealing himself as a penetration. This kind of reasoning, where any evidence can be interpreted as supporting the initial hypothesis, is fundamentally unfalsifiable and leads inevitably to paranoia. By the mid-1960s, the Mole Hunt had created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust within the CIA's Operations Directorate that made normal work increasingly difficult. Officers were afraid to share information with colleagues who might be under investigation. Operations were delayed or canceled because of concerns about security. Recruitment of Soviet intelligence officers became nearly impossible because Angleton suspected that any Soviet volunteer might be a KGB plant sent to waste CIA resources or to spread disinformation. One of the officers who came under suspicion early in the investigation was Peter Carlo, a CIA technical operations officer who had served in the agency since 1947. Carlo had worked on various technical surveillance operations and had been involved in several cases that had been compromised or had produced disappointing results. Based on this circumstantial evidence, Angleton's staff opened a file on Carlo in 1962. The investigation of Carlo continued for several years, during which time his career stagnated and he was denied promotions. In 1963, he was forced to resign from the CIA under pressure, though he was never formally charged with any wrongdoing. Carlo maintained his innocence and spent years fighting to clear his name. In 1997, more than 3 decades after his forced resignation, the CIA formally acknowledged that it had no evidence that Carlo had ever engaged in espionage and issued an apology. He received financial compensation, though the exact amount was not publicly disclosed. Another casualty was David Murphy, chief of the CIA's Soviet Russia Division from 1961 to 1966. Several operations under his oversight had been compromised, and Angleton's investigation concluded he might be a KGB agent based on these circumstantial patterns. Murphy was never formally accused, but suspicion effectively ended his career advancement. He was reassigned to less sensitive positions and retired from the CIA in 1974, his reputation permanently damaged by unsubstantiated allegations. The most prominent victim of the mole hunt was probably Yuri Nosenko, a KGB officer who defected to the United States in February 1964 in Geneva, Switzerland. Nosenko claimed to have information about Soviet intelligence operations similar to what Golitsyn had provided, but in several respects his information contradicted Golitsyn's claims. Where Golitsyn had suggested extensive KGB penetrations of Western intelligence services, Nosenko's information suggested these penetrations were less extensive than Golitsyn had indicated. Where Golitsyn had claimed that various Western intelligence operations had been compromised by penetrations, Nosenko provided alternative explanations for some of these compromises. Angleton, heavily influenced by Golitsyn's theories, concluded that Nosenko must be a false defector, a KGB plant sent to discredit Golitsyn and to protect the real penetrations Golitsyn had warned about. Nosenko was subjected to what can only be described as harsh interrogation. For more than 3 years, from 1964 to 1967, he was held in solitary confinement in a CIA facility, interrogated repeatedly, subjected to hostile debriefings designed to break him and force him to confess to being a false defector. He never confessed because, as subsequent investigations concluded, there was nothing to confess to. In 1968, an internal CIA review determined that there was no credible evidence that Nosenko was a false defector and recommended that he be released and compensated. He was eventually accepted as a genuine defector, hired as a consultant to the CIA, and lived in the United States under a new identity until his death in 2008. The damage caused by the mole hunt extended far beyond the individual careers that were destroyed or damaged. The atmosphere of suspicion created by Angleton's investigation affected the CIA's operational effectiveness throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. Officers were reluctant to take risks or to propose aggressive operations because failure might result in suspicion of being a penetration. The Soviet Russia Division, which should have been aggressively recruiting Soviet intelligence officers and conducting operations to collect intelligence on Soviet military and political activities, instead became paralyzed by internal investigations and suspicion. Meanwhile, Golitsyn himself became increasingly difficult for the CIA to manage. After his initial debriefing period, during which he had provided genuinely valuable information, his claims became more and more expansive and less verifiable. His demands became more extreme, his theories more elaborate, and his willingness to cooperate with debriefing and analysis efforts decreased. He began to develop theories about long-term Soviet strategic deception operations that he claimed were designed to lull the West into complacency while the Soviet Union prepared for eventual global domination. One of Golitsyn's most significant theories, which he began articulating in the mid-1960s, concerned what he called the grand design, or the grand deception. He claimed that the apparent liberalization in some Eastern European countries, the increasing economic contacts between East and West, and the various détente initiatives being proposed by Soviet leaders were all part of an elaborate deception. Golitsyn argued that the Soviet Union was not genuinely interested in peaceful coexistence, but was instead implementing a multi-decade strategy to lower Western defenses, encourage Western European neutralism, and ultimately achieve Soviet dominance without war. As evidence for this theory, Golitsyn pointed to various developments in Soviet policy and Eastern European politics, interpreting them through the lens of his deception framework. When the Soviet Union allowed increased cultural exchanges with the West, Golitsyn claimed this was designed to infiltrate Western societies with agents and influence operations. When Czechoslovakia underwent political liberalization in 1968 during the Prague Spring, Golitsyn claimed this was a carefully controlled operation designed to give the false impression of reform while actually strengthening Soviet control. When the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia crushed the Prague Spring in August 1968, Golitsyn claimed this was a tactical adjustment within the larger strategic deception. Golitsyn's grand design theory suffered from the same methodological flaw as the mole hunt. It was unfalsifiable, capable of explaining any development as part of the deception. Evidence that appeared to contradict the theory could be explained as a particularly subtle aspect of the deception. Those who questioned the theory could be accused of having been deceived themselves or even of being part of the deception operation. Most professional intelligence analysts, both within the CIA and in Allied intelligence services, viewed Golitsyn's grand design theory as unconvincing. They believed that while the Soviet Union certainly engaged in deception and disinformation operations, as all intelligence services do, the idea of a coherent multi-decade master plan controlling every aspect of Soviet behavior was implausible. The Soviet Union, like any large bureaucratic system, was characterized by internal conflicts, competing interests, policy improvisations, and unintended consequences. The notion that Soviet leaders had, in the 1950s or 1960s, developed a detailed strategic plan extending decades into the future and had implemented this plan consistently despite changes in leadership, economic pressures, and external events strained credibility. But Angleton believed Golitsyn's theories, or at least found them consistent with his own worldview about Soviet deception capabilities. This belief further reinforced the atmosphere of suspicion within CIA counterintelligence. Any officer who questioned Golitsyn's theories or who argued for a more conventional interpretation of Soviet behavior risked being suspected of either being naive or, worse, of being a penetration trying to discredit Golitsyn to protect Soviet operations. The relationship between Golitsyn and the CIA became increasingly strained as the 1960s progressed. Golitsyn felt that the agency was not taking his warnings seriously enough. He believed that his information was being ignored or suppressed, possibly by the very penetrations he had warned about. By 1968, Golitsyn essentially broke off his formal relationship with the CIA and relocated to Britain, where he established contact with British intelligence services. Over the subsequent years, he would work intermittently with various Western intelligence agencies, though his credibility continued to decline as his theories became more elaborate and less connected to verifiable facts. In 1984, Golitsyn published a book titled New Lies for Old, in which he laid out his grand design theory in detail. The book claimed that the apparent liberalization in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe during the 1970s and early 1980s was entirely false, Find that Soviet leaders remained committed to communist ideology and global revolution, and that the West was being systematically deceived. He predicted that apparent reforms in the Soviet Union would eventually be revealed as strategic deceptions, and that Soviet power would ultimately be reasserted over Eastern Europe and expanded globally. The book found an audience among some anti-communist activists and among certain conservative political figures who were skeptical of détente and arms control. However, professional intelligence analysts generally dismissed it. The events that followed over the subsequent 5 years, the genuine reforms initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev after 1985, the collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe in 1989, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in 1991, thoroughly contradicted Golitsyn's theories. These events were clearly not part of any strategic deception designed to lull the West into complacency, but rather represented the actual systemic failure of the Soviet system that Golitsyn had claimed was impossible. Inside the CIA, the damage caused by Angleton's mole hunt and by the agency's excessive reliance on Golitsyn's theories gradually became undeniable. On December 24, 1974, CIA Director William Colby forced Angleton to resign, concluding that the counterintelligence chief's approach had paralyzed the agency's operations and had destroyed careers without producing any actual evidence of major penetrations. A subsequent internal review, conducted in the late 1970s, concluded that while Golitsyn had provided some valuable information in the immediate aftermath of his defection, the agency had given too much credence to his more speculative claims and had allowed those claims to drive investigations that lacked proper evidentiary foundations. The mole hunt's methodology was discredited, and many of the officers whose careers had been damaged by unfounded suspicion received apologies and, in some cases, financial compensation. The atmosphere of paranoia that had characterized CIA counterintelligence operations for more than a decade gradually dissipated as the agency implemented reforms designed to ensure that counterintelligence investigations were based on concrete evidence rather than theoretical frameworks or unfalsifiable assumptions. However, the profound irony of the Golitsyn case, the irony that would only become fully apparent in the 1990s, was that while the CIA had wasted more than a decade chasing shadows based on Golitsyn's vague and unsubstantiated claims, there actually had been a major KGB penetration operating inside the CIA's Operations Directorate throughout this entire period. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer working in the Soviet Counterintelligence Division, had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in April 1985. Between 1985 and his arrest in February 1994, Ames provided the KGB and its successor service with the identities of virtually every Soviet intelligence officer who was working as a CIA source. This information led to the execution of at least 10 people and the compromise of numerous operations. Ames had access to exactly the kind of sensitive information that Golitsyn had claimed was being leaked to the Soviets. Operations that Ames betrayed were exactly the kinds of operations that Golitsyn had claimed were being compromised by penetrations. But the mole hunt never identified Ames. The investigation had looked in the wrong places, using the wrong methodology, based on theoretical frameworks that were disconnected from the actual realities of Soviet intelligence operations. Angleton's counterintelligence staff had suspected dozens of innocent officers based on circumstantial evidence and unfalsifiable assumptions, but they had never focused on Ames, who was conducting exactly the kind of espionage activities Golitsyn had warned about. Ames was eventually identified not through Angleton's elaborate theorizing, but through conventional counterintelligence techniques, careful analysis of which officers had access to compromised information, financial records showing unexplained wealth, and traditional surveillance. The investigation that led to his arrest in 1994 was methodical, evidence-based, and focused, everything the mole hunt had not been. The question of how to evaluate Anatoly Golitsyn's legacy is complicated because it requires separating different aspects of his defection and his subsequent influence on Western intelligence operations. On one level, Golitsyn provided valuable intelligence in the immediate aftermath of his defection. Information he supplied led to the identification of actual Soviet agents operating in the West and helped Western intelligence services understand certain aspects of KGB operational methods and priorities. This contribution was genuine and significant. On another level, Golitsyn's more speculative claims, particularly his grand design theory and his vague allegations about penetrations of Western intelligence, did enormous damage. These claims, which lacked concrete evidence and which Golitsyn could not substantiate in any verifiable way, fed into existing suspicious tendencies within Western counterintelligence and provided justification for investigations that destroyed careers, paralyzed operations, and created an atmosphere of suspicion that lasted for more than a decade. The damage was compounded by the fact that Golitsyn's influence outlasted his actual contact with Western intelligence agencies. Long after he had stopped providing fresh information, long after he had become difficult to work with and had relocated to avoid CIA oversight, his theories continued to shape how certain intelligence officers and policymakers thought about Soviet behavior. The belief that every Soviet action must be interpreted as part of some elaborate deception became an article of faith for some analysts, immune to contrary evidence or alternative explanations. Part of the problem was structural. Intelligence services, by their nature, deal with uncertainty, deception, and incomplete information. In this environment, there is always a tension between being too trusting, accepting information at face value and potentially being deceived, and being too suspicious, seeing deception everywhere and paralyzing operations through excessive caution. Finding the right balance between these extremes is extraordinarily difficult, and intelligent people operating in good faith can disagree about where the balance should be struck. Angleton and those who believed Golitsyn's more extreme claims erred on the side of excessive suspicion. They assumed that apparent contradictions in defector reporting meant one defector must be false, rather than that the KGB might have compartmented information and different defectors might know different things. They assumed that unexplained compromises must mean penetrations rather than operational errors or bad luck. They assumed that policy changes in the Soviet Union must be deception rather than genuine shifts in Soviet thinking driven by economic pressures, generational changes, or simple policy failures. But their error was not simply one of analytical judgment. It was also an error of methodology. They built investigative frameworks that were unfalsifiable, where any evidence could be interpreted to support the initial hypothesis. They allowed theoretical assumptions to override empirical evidence. They investigated people based on circumstantial indicators rather than concrete facts. And they created an organizational culture where questioning these methods or assumptions was itself treated as suspicious. The human cost of these errors was considerable. Peter Carlo spent more than 3 decades under a cloud of suspicion for espionage he did not commit, his career destroyed by an investigation based on nothing more than the fact that some operations he had been involved in had gone wrong. David Murphy saw his career advancement blocked by allegations that were never substantiated and never should have been made. Yuri Nosenko was imprisoned and subjected to harsh interrogation for years because his information contradicted theories that Angleton had invested his credibility in defending. And beyond these individual cases, there were dozens of other officers whose careers were damaged, who were denied promotions, who were transferred to less sensitive positions, or who simply left the agency rather than work in an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion. There were operations that were never conducted because of fears about security. There were recruitment opportunities that were never pursued because potential recruits were suspected of being provocations. There was intelligence that was not collected, analysis that was not performed, and capabilities that were not developed because paranoia had replaced judgment. For Golitsyn himself, his life after defection followed a trajectory that seems to have brought him little satisfaction. He had left behind everything he had known, his country, his career, his extended family, for a new life in the West. But that new life became increasingly isolated. His relationship with the CIA deteriorated. His marriage to Svetlana eventually ended in divorce, though the specific circumstances and timing are not well documented in publicly available records. His relationship with his daughter Nina, who had been 14 when the family defected, became strained as she grew into adulthood and began to question her father's increasingly elaborate theories about Soviet deception. Golitsyn spent his later years living in Britain, largely reclusive, working on manuscripts that developed his grand design theory in ever more elaborate detail. He gave occasional interviews to researchers and journalists interested in Cold War intelligence history, but he remained convinced that the West had failed to heed his warnings. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, rather than acknowledging that this development contradicted his theories, Golitsyn claimed in subsequent writings that the collapse itself was the ultimate deception, that the Soviet Union had not really dissolved, but had simply reorganized itself while maintaining its fundamental goals and capabilities. This claim contradicted extensive documented evidence of genuine systemic collapse. The economic chaos in Russia during the 1990s, the genuine independence achieved by former Soviet republics, the transformation of Eastern European political systems, the reduction in Russian military capabilities, all of this was simply too substantial, too documented, and too consequential to be explained away as an elaborate performance. Golitsyn died in 2008 at the age of 81. His obituaries in Western newspapers were brief and focused primarily on his initial defection and on the controversy surrounding his influence on CIA counterintelligence operations. Those who had known him during his time with the CIA described him as intelligent but increasingly rigid in his thinking, unable or unwilling to revise his theories in light of contrary evidence, and ultimately more committed to his elaborate framework of Soviet deception than to the messy reality of how intelligence operations actually functioned. The Golitsyn case raises difficult questions about how intelligence services should handle defectors who provide a mixture of valuable information and speculative theories. Defectors are by their nature complicated sources. They have made a fundamental break with their previous lives, often motivated by complex mixtures of ideological conviction, personal grievances, fear for their safety, and desire for recognition or revenge. They possess genuinely valuable information about the organizations they defected from, but this information is inevitably incomplete, potentially outdated, and colored by their own biases and limited perspectives. Intelligence services need defector information, but they also need to evaluate it critically. The information must be corroborated where possible, tested against other sources, and assessed for credibility. The defectors' motivations must be understood and factored into how their information is used. The difference between what the defector actually knows and what they think they know must be carefully distinguished, and perhaps most importantly, there must be mechanisms to prevent defector information from being used to justify investigations or operations that lack independent evidentiary support. The CIA's handling of Golitsyn violated many of these principles. The agency accepted his speculative claims about Soviet deception without demanding adequate substantiation. It allowed his vague allegations about penetrations to drive investigations that lasted years and destroyed careers without producing evidence. It permitted Golitsyn's influence over counterintelligence operations to continue long after his actual information had been exhausted and his theories had become increasingly detached from reality. Part of the explanation for these failures lies in the personality and preconceptions of James Angleton. As chief of counterintelligence, Angleton had enormous influence over how the CIA evaluated defector reporting and conducted internal investigations. His conviction that Soviet intelligence operated according to sophisticated long-term deception plans predisposed him to accept Golitsyn's similar claims. His personal relationship with Golitsyn, the two men developed a close working relationship that, in some accounts, bordered on friendship, may have clouded his judgment about the credibility of Golitsyn's more speculative assertions. But the failures were also organizational. The CIA in the 1960s lacked adequate mechanisms for challenging or reviewing counterintelligence investigations. Angleton's counterintelligence staff operated with considerable autonomy, and there were limited checks on its power to investigate officers or to influence personnel decisions based on suspicions that lacked concrete evidence. The agency's organizational culture discouraged questioning the judgments of senior officers like Angleton, particularly on matters related to Soviet intelligence, where Angleton was considered an expert. These organizational failures were eventually addressed through reforms implemented in the mid-1970s, after Angleton's forced resignation. New procedures were established requiring that counterintelligence investigations be based on specific evidence rather than theoretical frameworks. Review mechanisms were created to ensure that investigations did not continue indefinitely without producing results. Personnel decisions affecting officers under investigation were subjected to additional oversight to prevent careers from being destroyed on the basis of unsubstantiated suspicions. But these reforms came too late for the officers whose careers had already been damaged, for the operations that had been compromised or abandoned, and for more than a decade of operational effectiveness that had been lost to paranoia and internal investigations. The broader question raised by the Golitsyn case concerns how societies and institutions should balance the need for security against the risks of excessive suspicion. During the Cold War, the threat from Soviet intelligence was real. The KGB did recruit agents within Western governments and intelligence services. Classified information was compromised, operations were betrayed, lives were lost. The need for vigorous counterintelligence was genuine, and those responsible for protecting against penetrations faced extraordinarily difficult challenges. But the response to genuine threats can itself become destructive when it crosses the line from appropriate vigilance into paranoia. When the methods used to identify penetrations lack proper evidentiary foundations, they destroy the organizations they are meant to protect. When the atmosphere becomes one of pervasive suspicion where everyone is potentially a traitor, normal operations become impossible and morale collapses. When theoretical frameworks become unfalsifiable, when any evidence can be interpreted to support the initial assumption of deception, then the search for truth is abandoned in favor of confirmation of pre-existing beliefs. The Golitsyn case demonstrates how this progression from appropriate vigilance to destructive paranoia can occur. It shows how an initial nucleus of genuine information can be built into an elaborate theoretical structure that becomes increasingly disconnected from reality. It shows how individuals with strong preconceptions can interpret ambiguous evidence to confirm their beliefs. It shows how organizational cultures can suppress dissent and critical thinking. And it shows how the consequences of these failures extend far beyond abstract policy debates to damage the lives of real people. The victims of the mole hunt, officers like Carlo and Murphy and Nosenko, were not abstract casualties of the Cold War. They were individuals with families, with careers they had built over decades, with professional reputations that mattered to them. When they found themselves under investigation for espionage based on nothing more than circumstantial indicators and theoretical frameworks, their lives were upended. Some were forced to resign. Others saw their careers stagnate as promotions were denied and responsibilities were reassigned. Still others were transferred to positions where they could do less damage if the suspicions proved true, effectively sidelining them from meaningful work. For these officers, the damage was compounded by the fact that they could not effectively defend themselves. In normal criminal investigations, the accused have certain rights: to know the charges against them, to confront their accusers, to present evidence in their defense. But counterintelligence investigations operated in secrecy without these protections. Officers under investigation often did not know they were suspected. Those who did know often could not learn the specific evidence or accusations against them because counterintelligence information was highly classified. They could not confront witnesses or challenge the methodology of the investigation because they lacked access to the investigation itself. This asymmetry, where investigators had enormous power while those under investigation had minimal ability to defend themselves, created conditions where errors were almost inevitable. Without proper safeguards, without requirements for concrete evidence, without mechanisms for independent review, counterintelligence investigations could continue indefinitely based on nothing more than suspicion and theoretical speculation. And the reforms implemented after Angleton's resignation attempted to address these structural problems by creating additional oversight, requiring higher standards of evidence, and providing some protections for officers under investigation. But the fundamental tension remained. Counterintelligence investigations must necessarily involve some secrecy and some acceptance of incomplete evidence. Yet these same characteristics create risks of error and injustice. The question of what motivated Golitsyn, why he defected, why he made the claims he did, why he clung to theories that became increasingly unsupportable, is difficult to answer definitively. He may have genuinely believed his elaborate theories about Soviet deception. He may have been motivated by a desire to remain relevant and important to the intelligence services that had provided him refuge. He may have been unable to accept that his defection, which had cost him everything he had known in the Soviet Union, might ultimately have contributed as much harm as good to the Western cause he claimed to serve. In his final years, living in seclusion in Britain, Golitsyn continued to work on manuscripts expanding his theories. These documents, based on accounts from the few people who saw them, became increasingly elaborate and increasingly detached from verifiable facts. They described Soviet deception operations spanning decades, involving thousands of agents, manipulating every aspect of East-West relations, all according to a master plan that supposedly had been conceived in the 1950s and implemented with perfect consistency thereafter. The documents were never published in their complete form and are believed to remain in private hands or in intelligence service archives. They represent the final evolution of a worldview that began with genuine insights into Soviet intelligence operations, but ended in a framework so all-encompassing that it could explain everything while proving nothing. And the people whose lives were damaged by this worldview, the CIA officers who lost careers, the defectors who were mistreated, the operations that were abandoned, received apologies, sometimes financial compensation, sometimes official acknowledgments that they had been wrongly suspected. But these gestures, while better than nothing, could not restore what had been lost, The years spent under suspicion, the professional opportunities that disappeared, the relationships that were damaged, the sense of purpose that comes from meaningful work. The Golitsyn case stands as a warning about the dangers of allowing theoretical frameworks to override evidence, of permitting unfalsifiable assumptions to drive investigations, and of creating organizational cultures where questioning becomes suspect and dissent is treated as disloyalty. These dangers exist in all organizations and in all periods, but they are particularly acute in intelligence services operating in secret against adversaries who do engage in deception and disinformation. The challenge that the CIA failed to meet during the mole hunt, and that all intelligence services must constantly struggle with, is to maintain appropriate vigilance against genuine threats while avoiding the descent into paranoia that sees threats everywhere, trusts no one, and ultimately destroys the organization from within. It requires maintaining a balance between openness and security, between trust and verification, between theoretical analysis and empirical evidence. And it requires creating institutional structures and cultural norms that can sustain this balance even under pressure, even when faced with ambiguous evidence, and even when dealing with individuals who claim to possess unique insights into the adversary's intentions and capabilities. Anatoly Golitsyn claimed to possess such insights. For more than a decade, Western intelligence services treated these claims as credible and allowed them to shape counterintelligence operations and investigations. The consequences were destructive and long-lasting, and the lessons learned came at enormous cost to individuals whose only error was to work in an organization where suspicion had replaced judgment and where theories had replaced evidence. Golitsyn was 35 years old when he walked into the American Embassy in Helsinki in December 1961. He was 81 when he died in 2008, having spent nearly half a century in the West. The initial information he provided after his defection was valuable and led to genuine counterintelligence successes. But his subsequent influence on Western intelligence operations was profoundly destructive, encouraging an atmosphere of paranoia that damaged careers, paralyzed operations, and diverted resources away from genuine threats. And in between his defection and his death, he constructed an elaborate theoretical edifice that explained everything, predicted nothing, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions when the Soviet Union itself dissolved and the Cold War ended, not through deception, but through the simple failure of a system that could no longer sustain itself.